You ever heard of black-eyed children, those little demon creatures? Well, they stalked me. This is such a wild story, but I absolutely have to tell it. So some years back, I was living in a really unique living situation. I was living in a national park. It only had room for the caretaker, but it was a duplex, so he ended up turning it into a rental unit. And I moved into there with my son. This decommissioned lighthouse was part of this national park, and it was right there on like a cliff peninsula in San Diego, right on the San Diego Bay. And so while you're like right there in the bay, you're still pretty isolated out there. And it was a very creepy location. Not least of all because you have to drive through an extensive military cemetery to get there. But basically, the park, like any national park, closes at sunset, but this especially closed at 5. And after that, I would have to get in through a really rusty gate. I think it was pretty corroded because of the sea air. There wasn't much to be done about it, but it did make it a security concern when I would come home late at night and my little clicker wouldn't work. I used to MC karaoke, and so it wasn't unusual for me to get home at like 12:30, 1 a.m. I was already anxious to get home that night, but then, of course, the gate was not working, and I kept clicking it, because boy, did I not want to get out that night. I was like, open up, you rusty bitch, but it never did, and so I knew that was it. I was going to have to get out and do it manually. And I'm kind of bathing the whole thing in my headlights so that I can see the pin pad, because I'm old, and my eyes aren't working like they used to. So as I'm trying to figure it out, I hear this odd little voice say, "Ma'am, can you help us?" And I say odd because not only was it a child's voice, but it was kind of robotic, devoid of personality. Already so caught off guard. I mean, this was so unusual. We were way up there on a cliff. There is no way some kid could have just come gallivanting up. And it was hours after closing, so they couldn't have been left there by their parents. Just none of it. So as I'm looking around trying to identify where this voice came from, I start hearing the rustling in the leaves. And this voice says again, "Can you help us?" And I'm like, us? Like one wasn't enough. So I identify where it's coming from. I look, and there are indeed 2 little freaking kids wearing hoodies, and even weirder, they're wearing sunglasses. Dude, it's like 12:30 at night, right? I was like, "Where are your parents?" They ignored me and said, "Let us in," at the same time. I said, "Let you in where?" And she hisses, "Anywhere." Now, before you say anything, I do have a maternal instinct. I do have a child of my own. And at any other point in my life, or even that day, I would have been happy to try and find their parents. But when I tell you that something about them was so off that I felt genuinely frightened. They were affectless, like robots, like automatons, just kind of standing there droning on. I was at a loss, and I was kind of in a whole fight or flight situation. And to my great relief, suddenly some headlights started bouncing up the hill behind me, which was very, very odd. No one lived up there except for me and the old caretaker, but I did not care. I was just so happy for the distraction. But wildly enough, while they had been rustling on the way in, they didn't make a noise on the way out, because when I looked around, they were completely gone. So I get home and I call the cops just in case some strange little children had been left there. But they never found anybody. Now, I do wish this was the end of my story, but it is certainly not. They became a plague for me and my son, and with them came pestilence and nightmares, and we feared for our life. There is a whole story about these black-eyed children.